Sometimes, actually probably most times, we forget how fortunate we are to know Jesus Christ and to know God. Many of us grew up Catholic, and probably even more of us were introduced to Christ at a young age. There was a little girl who was not so fortunate, born in southwestern Sudan in the 1860s. She was kidnapped when she was around 8 years old by Arab slave traders and given the Arabic name Bakita. She was passed from master to master and endured unimaginable cruelty. Finally, one of Bakita's owners brought her to Italy, where she learned about Christ from the Canossian sisters. When her mistress wanted to take her back to Sudan, the archbishop and the sisters convinced an Italian court to intervene. They determined she could not be considered a slave and was free. She joined the Canossian sisters and is now known as Saint Josephine Bakita, whose feast day was yesterday. Later in life, she said that she would thank her kidnappers if she could, because despite all the suffering that she endured, in the end, she came to know Christ. And this does not absolve or negate what they did, but shows both the power of God to bring goodness out of the greatest suffering and also the great value of the knowledge of Him. In Arabic, the name Bakita that she was given after her kidnapping means fortunate. Saint Josephine Bakita said, "Be good, love the Lord, pray for those who do not know Him. What a great grace it is to know God." Paul also emphasizes the value of the knowledge of God today in his letter to the Corinthians. He shows that this knowledge is not like human knowledge. Many in Corinth held the ancient philosophers in incredibly high regard and expected Paul to wow them with philosophy and rhetoric that would rival the greats like Socrates and Aristotle. But Paul says, "My message and my proclamation were not with persuasive words of wisdom." This was difficult for many of them to understand, because Paul certainly could have used that approach. He was incredibly well educated and was highly regarded as a teacher in the Jewish communities. But Paul stands firm as he says, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." He knows that without this knowledge of Christ, all the human knowledge of the world, in the end, is worthless. We are like St. Paul and St. Josephine Bakita in that we too know this wisdom beyond all human wisdom. We know Jesus Christ. We hear His word proclaimed, and we are nourished at the table of His body and blood. And Christ is speaking to each one of us today when He says, "You are the salt of the earth and the light of the world." Not you can be or you will be, but you are. We are salt and light by virtue of knowing the Christ. And the light imagery is pretty clear. We should not hide this light. We should not cover it, but should make it visible for all to see. We should illuminate the world with it. But the salt imagery is a little harder for us to get without knowing exactly how valuable salt was in the time of Christ. The word salary comes from a Roman soldier's payment in sal, salt. Salt not only adds flavor, but it preserves. Long before refrigeration, salt dramatically increased the shelf life of so many foods. But there is another side of salt, best seen in the practice of sowing salt in the fields of your enemies. If land is too salty, plants struggle to grow. And throughout the Old Testament and the records of nearby communities during those times, there was a practice of sowing salt in the land of a conquered enemy. Whether this was ceremonial or if it was actually done to a level that would cause crop failure isn't always clear. But it was certainly in the people's understanding that salt could be a great help, but also dangerous. And Jesus is saying that this knowledge of him, this supernatural wisdom, is incredibly powerful. And this is something that the Israelites experienced to some degree. They had power to be the light to the nations, to bring about good. But as we see again today in Isaiah, God has to keep bringing them back to himself after they get themselves into all kinds of trouble. We are the salt of the earth. We can go out into the world and prevent the decay of sin, preserve the virtue in those around us. We can add flavor to the lives of those we meet, and not with our wisdom, but by uniting ourselves to Jesus Christ and him crucified. But we can also cause harm. How many have rejected the message of Christ because of an act of hypocrisy by one of his followers? This should not frighten us to the point that we bury our talent in the ground, but simply remind us of the great task that we have been given by virtue of our baptism. Not only to live a holy life for our own sake, but to live that life for all the Bakitas of the world who are enduring such sorrow, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but through it all have been guided by God so that they can catch a glimpse of his light shining forth in us. And we pray that more and more might join St. Josephine Bakita in saying, "What a great grace it is to know God."